Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners. When Russia invaded Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians left their homes in search of safety. But this wasn't the only large-scale migration that began in the fateful year of 2022. During the same period, hundreds of thousands of Russians also left their country, escaping mobilization and the increasingly authoritarian nature of Vladimir Putin's regime. Some out of fear, others to avoid the draft. According to some estimates, up to 1 million Russians may have decided to leave their homeland. It is unclear how many of them ended up in Central Asia, as local governments have not released comprehensive data. What is clear, however, is that this migration has had a profound impact on local societies and the region as a whole. Today we look at Russian wartime migration into Central Asia, how it unfolded, what motivated Russians to choose the region as their destination, how they rebuilt their lives there, and how this movement has reshaped Central Asia. Joining us is Yan Matusevich, a journalist and Ph.D. candidate in cultural anthropology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. His doctoral research focuses on the experiences of Russian exiles who have relocated to Central Asia since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Welcome to Turan Talks. Hey Yan, how are you? Thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Thank you for having me, Agnieszka.
So today we'll talk about something that you are a specialist in. So the Russian exodus to Central Asia following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is something that you're doing your PhD on. And I would like to ask you, when did the exodus really begin? And what was the atmosphere in the region at the time?
So I think we can distinguish between several waves. And in fact, I would say that the Russians that arrived in Central Asia, they distinguish among themselves between different waves. So I just barely missed the first one because those tended to arrive right after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so that was in March. And in fact, a lot of them refer to themselves as Martovsky, so those who arrived in March. And then you have the second and much bigger wave, which came after September, after the announcement of the partial mobilization. And there I happened to already be in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan at the time, and I experienced it kind of unfold before my eyes. And so I would say that the first group was quite small. Central Asia was not necessarily a popular destination. Those who left in the first weeks and months after the Russian invasion, many of them had social or financial capital and connections or visas and could get to either Western Europe, or many of them went to first Turkey, others went to Israel if they had any family connections there, or to the US. And so there were, a few thousand that went to Central Asia, to Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan in particular, because they're members of the Eurasian Economic Union. And so they didn't need a foreign travel passport. And so you had a small number arrive immediately in the wake of the invasion. And often one of the main reasons was that they didn't have a travel passport and they needed somewhere to be relatively safe, and so that they could plan kind of the next move. And then also in that time frame between March and September, there were also a lot of people going for what were called card runs. So as the sanctions came into force against the Russian banking system, for example, a lot of Russian citizens turned to Central Asia in order to get credit cards and bank accounts in order to be able to have access services, to travel, to be able to make purchases online. And so there was this travel industry where people would go on these tours and they would come for just a few days to Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan even, and Kazakhstan, and then get a bank account within a few days. But those people were there temporarily, so they usually didn't stay longer than a few days or a few weeks. And then in September, when the partial mobilization happened, I was in Bishkek and I had just started my research, and I thought I was going to do this kind of small community study of just, a handful of Russian dissidents who had set up their temporary home in Kyrgyzstan, and I had quickly met them. They all tended to gravitate around a few kind of safe houses or shared houses where they lived. And then the partial mobilization happened and kind of all hell broke loose. And all of a sudden you had literally thousands of people there. The difficulty with this topic is that we still actually to this day, and I'm struggling, I'm almost finished with my dissertation, but we don't have clear migration statistics. And I don't think it's a coincidence because I've, had informal discussions with government officials about this. For example, Kyrgyzstan has a very good kind of migration tracking system for statistics, but I don't think it's a coincidence, they've stopped releasing that data ever since 2022. And so you get sort of statements by different government officials. They tend to contradict each other. And so I've been trying to find a ballpark estimate about kind of how many people we're talking about. And I try to be conservative because I think a lot of huge numbers were thrown around, and we have to keep in mind that these people move around and go on to third destinations. But I would say kind of at its peak, we're probably looking at around maybe 70,000 in Kazakhstan. And I get this number based on the number of tax IDs that were released. So what's called the ENN in Kazakhstan, that's kind of an indication. Doesn't mean that all 70,000 are still in the country, but that's probably the peak. Uzbekistan, they released their data on the amount of Russian citizens who registered to live there temporarily. You're looking at about 35,000 at its peak. And for Kyrgyzstan, which was the trickiest one because Kyrgyzstan had the most kind of open border policy towards Russian citizens, I think it peaked at maybe 50,000, but is much lower now. So that's kind of, if you put that all together, then I think, towards the end of 2022, maybe you had over 120,000 at some point in all of Central Asia. And even that, please take it with a grain of salt. That's the best estimate I can give you.
And what were the reasons why Russians decided to move to Central Asia and not to other destinations? What were the main reasons why people ended up there? Is it because of proximity? Is it because of availability of tickets? The fact that those countries are cheap? Or what were the main reasons?
Yeah, it's a combination of all those things. So one factor which I think is really important is after the partial mobilization, those who left had not been preparing to leave. They had to find a solution really quickly. There was mass panic that, people were going to get conscripted. And so most of my respondents, and this is the case for Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, because for Uzbekistan, you actually need a travel passport. So I'll focus on Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. You don't need a foreign travel passport. You can use your internal passport, your внутренний passport, your Russian one. You can use it to get into the country. There are only 3 countries you can do this with. I mean, Belarus, but Belarus is not an option, not a safe destination. So it left Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. So you could just pack your bag and be there the next day. You didn't need to prepare anything in terms of documents. They were also members of the Eurasian Economic Union, so you could kind of stay there indefinitely, although that has since changed. And then proximity, yes, I don't have a representative sample, but what was really interesting to me is that many of those who arrived in Central Asia came from the Ural region or from Siberia or from the Far East. And many of them, because tickets were so expensive compared to certain destinations, I guess Bishkek was cheaper, but in the weeks and months after mobilization, flight prices to Central Asia were absolutely insane. So I don't think cost was necessarily a factor, but many of them actually got there by land. So they would either drive in their own car or have their family members drive them to the Kazakh border and then take the train or the bus and then continue onwards in Central Asia. And yes, money was also a factor. So I think class plays a very important role. It's a diverse group of people, but I would say overall, I found that those who came to Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan in particular, because Kyrgyzstan is more affordable than Kazakhstan, those who arrived tended to come from kind of lower socioeconomic classes. They were quite young. Many of them were still students and really didn't have family or anybody to rely on. So it was kind of the most accessible and affordable destination for them.
And tell me, what did Russians know about Central Asia before coming to the region? We know that there are a lot of stereotypes about Central Asian migrants in Russia. There is a lot of racism, a lot of discrimination. Many people assume that Central Asians are, less educated, that Central Asia is a backwards region. So what kind of expectations did Russians have before relocating into Central Asian countries, and how those stereotypes have changed?
Yeah, so that's what's really fascinating, kind of at the center of my doctoral research, actually, because previously I'd spent a lot of time doing work on the experiences of Central Asian labor migrants in Russia. So I knew the racism and the xenophobia faced by Central Asians in Russia. And I had this kind of assumption when going into this research that I would find all of these stereotypes that you just mentioned, fully on display among these Russian migrants. And I would ask a lot of questions about that. And what I quickly realized, which was interesting and made me kind of rethink my research in many ways, was that actually what I encountered mostly was utter ignorance, I would say. I mean, yes, there's certain forms of kind of implicit xenophobia that's always there, and people did express everything that you mentioned. But overall, particularly those who I would say kind of Gen Z, right, from 18 to 25, they knew next to nothing about Central Asia, to the point where I would often ask people about, what they thought about kind of the Soviet past. And then I realized, oh, wow, actually, a lot of my respondents are not aware of the fact that Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan were part of the Soviet Union.
Wow, really?
Yes.
That's crazy.
I mean, not to even speak about Russian colonial history and the Russian Empire, that's too far in the past. And so they came with like really not a lot of knowledge, and in fact were surprised to find that people still spoke Russian. So they didn't expect people to speak Russian in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And it was fascinating to me because at the moment of the partial mobilization, I had just enrolled in a Kyrgyz language class. And it was just me with a bunch of high school students from Bishkek who were non-ethnic Kyrgyz or Kyrgyz who didn't speak Kyrgyz language, and were trying to prepare for their high school exams. And then all of a sudden we had like 15 new students who were Russian migrants who had just arrived. And I was shocked because I thought, like, this kind of goes, why would they sign up for a Kyrgyz language course, right? You would assume this kind of Russian chauvinist attitude that they would just assume everyone speaks Russian and not bother to learn Kyrgyz. And I thought, wow, that shows really a certain amount of tolerance that I didn't expect. But then when I started talking to them, I realized they thought, well, we're right in a new country. We have to learn the language because otherwise, how are we going to speak with locals? And then within a month, they all dropped the course because they realized, oh, in Bishkek, you can get by with Russian. You don't need Kyrgyz. So these were kind of the things that made me really reassess my line of questioning in my research. And I think the tension that was always there, and I did this fieldwork for 2 years, so I followed kind of a group of respondents for over 2 years who stayed in Kyrgyzstan. And what I found was that people navigated between two extremes, that Central Asia was both too alien, like you said, the kind of stereotypes about it being this orientalized vision of the Orient, and a lot of it connected with Islam and so on, but also not foreign enough, as post-Soviet and ultimately actually quite familiar. And so they were kind of navigating between these two poles and trying to make sense of their experience there.
How did Central Asian populations respond to the rapid influx of so many people from Russia? I remember I was mostly watching Uzbek social media, and in the beginning at least, there was quite a lot of openness and hospitality, and also, every single time Russians were recording, TikToks or some videos about how amazing Uzbekistan is, how oriental. I think that Uzbeks really appreciated it, that somebody, is visiting their country, somebody foreign is interested in their culture. How was it on this bigger scale? How do you assess it?
So I think overall I agree with you. I mean, most of the respondents that I talked to, they had an overwhelmingly positive experience in terms of how they were welcomed. Many of them, this was kind of right in the beginning, You probably saw this on the border between Kazakhstan and Russia. Some of those Kazakh cities, they would open movie theaters and shopping malls to let people sleep, or school gyms and so on, hand out food and drink. And you kind of had the same thing in Bishkek, where restaurants would hand out food because there were really Russians with backpacks who had no idea where to go, and people were really helpful. So I think generally they had a positive experience. But I think the attitude among locals was a mix. On the one side, there was also economic opportunity. You have an influx of people who are, for people who are in the service industry, this was a huge boon. This was great. You have a lot more clients. On the other hand, it also drove real estate prices through the roof. Right. So all of a sudden you had really ugly situations, I think, all over, in Almaty and also in Bishkek, where you had local students, right, who had come from the regions who were being evicted from their apartments in order to be rented for triple the price to Russian migrants. So you had a lot of that happening in the first month. So that caused a kind of negative response. Then there was this kind of sense of bitterness that I also noticed on social media and also among kind of the younger generation, where they thought, well, we know how we are treated as Central Asian migrants in Russia, and the systematic discrimination that is there, the police brutality, the exploitation by employers, and so on. And, and here Russians are arriving and they're treated so well, with kind of open arms. And so I think there was a sense of kind of bitterness at that. And then also, I think a lot of it was, there was a lot of humor, also a lot of jokes online, kind of using anti-migrant stereotypes that were applied to Central Asians in Russia, reusing them towards the Russian migrants. So people would say kind of racist expression in Russian that Moscow is not, Nyerezinovaya is not, it has its limits, it's not elastic. It's saying, there are too many foreigners. And so people started posting the same thing about Bishkek or Almaty. So there was quite a lot of that on social media. And then there were also jokes about how do you spot a Russian? They're always wearing a backpack and they're holding onto it tight, and kind of that's how they walk around the city. And so then I think as time went on, there was kind of a more mixed response.
What does life look like for a Russian migrant in Central Asia? So what kind of jobs those people usually have? Can they actually apply for some local jobs, or do they all work remotely? What does it look like? And does this situation differ in different Central Asian countries? Because, at some point, at least, in Uzbekistan, there was this theory that a lot of Russian businessmen are bringing businesses to Uzbekistan. So it can, in effect, create also jobs for local people and jobs that are better quality than the ones offered by local businesses. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So I think there's this kind of stereotype about the Russians, just in general, the Russians that have migrated, right? The term relocant that came about. Actually, I kind of looked into the history of that term, and the term actually, it looks like it comes from Belarus, when there was the big crackdown after the stolen elections in Belarus, and a lot of Belarusian IT workers, because it was a big IT hub, they ended up being relocated to like Poland or Cyprus by their companies, and they started referring to themselves with this new word, relocant. And then Russians started applying it to themselves after the invasion of Ukraine. By the way, there was also a kind of negative response to that, where Central Asians say, well, why are we called migrants, but you get to, use this other term for yourself? And that's a whole kind of separate thing we can talk about. But in terms of jobs, I would say that I also had the stereotype that I thought most would be working remotely, mostly in IT, for employers in Russia. But I think the reality is much more complicated because of what I mentioned before, the fact that they come from poor socioeconomic background, also tended to be quite young, so didn't necessarily have a lot of work experience, I would say, in many cases, and didn't have a lot of money. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that they were all, IT workers. A certain percentage, maybe a quarter. A lot of people did do online work. This is more anecdotal, but I would say that there were maybe more like therapists and life coaches than IT workers.
Interesting.
So I managed among my respondents, there were quite a few who were therapists and continued to doing therapy online with their clients over Zoom in Russia, or fitness trainers or nutritionists, or all of this kind of self-improvement stuff. I think that was quite significant.
That's a big thing in Russia as well, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and then you had a group of kind of younger Russians who tried to find employment in Central Asia. The situation differs in terms legally also, because Kazakhstan actually very quickly restricted access to its labor market. And in terms of migration, already in January 23, they introduced new regulations making it a requirement for Russian citizens to apply for a work permit, for a residence permit. And it created this whole industry in Kazakhstan of fake work contracts in order to legalize their stay in Kazakhstan. Kyrgyzstan was much more liberal until about September of 2024. They also, mirroring Kazakhstan, introduced a residence permit, but it's much easier to get still. All you need to prove is that you have enough money to kind of survive, I think, for 6 months. But still, they've restricted access. But on paper, if you get a job in any of those countries, you should, according to the Eurasian Economic Union, which I think the Eurasian Economic Union now is more of a fiction than a reality in terms of how it's implemented, but you get access to the local labor market. And so a lot of them went into the service industry. Still have many respondents in Bishkek who work in bars and coffee shops, actually delivery workers. So that's kind of a big irony. Also, a lot of people got a kind of kick out of it on social media that you had Russian delivery workers, given the fact that an overwhelming amount of delivery workers in Russia are from Central Asia. But now you kind of had the reverse situation. So many of them did that. A lot of them went to work in the tourism industry eventually. So they kind of started to realize that, well, there's a lot of opportunity for tourism. And before the war, Russians didn't really, Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan were not huge destinations for tourists. But because of the war, they're also limited in the amount of destinations they can go to as tourists. And so actually, with the arrival of Russians fleeing mobilization, you also have an increase in the number of tourists, which makes for also a kind of uncomfortable situation for many of them, because they left Russia because they either didn't want to be conscripted or don't agree politically with what's going on there. And yet their job, their new employment, it depends on the arrival of Russian tourists who maybe actually support the war or, work for state authorities. So, I mean, some of them went into our entrepreneurs, went into kind of trade. There's also, I wouldn't go so far as necessarily to call it sanction evasion, but there's a lot of what's called parallel import going on. And there are a lot of companies that are helping to kind of get goods from China, from the West, from other places. It transits through Central Asia. And so there are employment opportunities there. But generally, especially in the beginning, a lot of them struggle a lot because salaries are quite low, particularly in Kyrgyzstan. And many of them, some of the ones who had the least amount of money, I visited, they would live 12, 13, 14, sometimes 15 people in the same house.
So just like Central Asians in Russia.
Exactly. Yeah. There you go. Yeah.
That's ironic. Very interesting. Hey, quick little break. Thanks for listening to Turan Tales. We're a tiny independent show supported by listeners like you. If you like our work, you can get a paid subscription at turantales.substack.com/subscribe or buymeacoffee.com/turantales. Okay, back to the episode. Tell me, who stayed, or what kind of people decided to stay in Central Asia and who left? Because we know, as you said in the beginning, that the numbers have changed drastically and that for many people, Central Asia was just a stop on the way to, somewhere else, to a different destination. So what kind of people, if we can, create a sociological profile of such a person, stayed?
So it varies. I would say that those who stayed, often they ended up kind of building a community there. So I think it also depends very much on class, because there's a certain group of people, I would say in kind of the two cultural capitals, I guess in Tashkent, in Almaty, in Bishkek, those who started hanging out with, I don't know if I could call it like the kind of cultural bubble, right? The people who are in the arts, the creative class, often ended up, because of the common language, they ended up making friendships and building a community and feeling actually very comfortable. And for a lot of my respondents, this exile was a very liberatory experience. They often came from smaller towns or from, living with their parents who they had disagreements with, or feeling oppressed by the political situation in Russia and so on. And so, in fact, I think not everyone lived it as a kind of traumatic experience of having to leave your home, but actually as a new start and now have reinvented themselves as artists or DJs or choreographers or so on. And so I think that group of people, they feel quite comfortable. And if you have your kind of social environment around you, then you end up staying. And there are actually quite a lot of opportunities also because Central Asia is going through an economic boom. And so the longer people have stayed, the more well integrated they are into these societies. You also have, this happens with any kind of migration flow, right? You also have stories of love, of people falling in love and getting married and having children. And so far, it's been, this war is still ongoing. And so people have really started to settle down. And then I would say that those who have left, there are multiple reasons. I would say those who were politically active in Russia, they found it increasingly unsafe to stay in Central Asia. Kyrgyzstan was kind of unsafe from the very beginning, and now it looks increasingly like Kazakhstan as well. So we've had several cases of extraditions. In Kazakhstan's cases, extraditions. In Kyrgyzstan's, I would almost call them kidnappings because people were disappeared and then the next day they appear in a courtroom in Russia and there's no paper trails. And so that spooked a lot of people. Some respondents just went completely apolitical. And others decided, well, I'm not going to risk it and I'm going to go somewhere else. And so there's been a big move to Southeast Asia. So people are moving to Vietnam. Also, India, for example, is a popular destination. Latin America, a lot of people who were politically active from the first wave, they went to Argentina. And then I would say there's a third category that kind of fits in neither, who are just still in constant movement. So I think that's become a very common way of life that's circular. So you spend a few months, usually the summer months because they're nice, in Central Asia. Then you go to Southeast Asia. Then you might go to another destination, Georgia, Armenia, and you kind of shuffle between these destinations. And some people have been living like this since 2022. So those are kind of the three different groups, I would say. And then I think what's also important, an important factor to mention, right? We tend to talk about Russian migrants as kind of this one homogenous category in terms of their employment, but they're also very diverse, also ethnically. And I think that's an important factor because I think ethnic minorities from Russia, particularly from Turkic groups, so like the Saha people or Bashkirs, Tatars, they tended to, not always, but they often tended to have a very different experience in Central Asia. First of all, if they knew their native language, they could learn the local language much easier. And others they had this kind of pan-Turkic awakening, I would say, and felt very comfortable, very at home, or felt like, oh, I can finally be proud of my roots in a way that I don't feel comfortable being in Russia. I had several respondents from Bashkortostan, where there's been really a repression of kind of Bashkir nationalism, where they feel much more comfortable in Central Asia. So I think those types of people have tended to really settle, and I think relatively for good. But it's often difficult to predict who will end up moving back and who will end up staying or going to a third destination.
For those of you who are interested to find out more about the situation of Saha people in Kazakhstan, Turan Tales did a story about that last year, so you can look it up in our archives. But coming back to our subject, do we know anything about people who decided to return to Russia?
Yeah, so there's been I would say probably, my estimates would say over half ended up returning. But I would say what I've noticed, this kind of trend, is that usually those who return, they returned within the first year. So relatively quickly, because it became quite apparent that this partial mobilization, was not being evenly implemented. And so if you came from a position of relative privilege, particularly if you were from St. Petersburg or Moscow, then your chances of being conscripted were actually quite low. And so kind of when this panic subsided and people started running out of money, relatively quickly, then there was a kind of return wave back to Russia. But I would say since then, those who stayed over a year have tended to either go on to a third country or remain in Central Asia. So I have not seen, there's this kind of, I think it's not a myth, but a lot of people think, well, all the Russians have left. They came, they stayed for a little bit, well, they could and they left. I don't share that view. Yes, the numbers have gone down, but I actually think a lot more people have stayed than is often assumed. And the people that ended up returning, there are various reasons, right? There could be family reasons, running out of money. Also, there's an important gendered element to this migration, right? It's overwhelmingly male. And so there were also a lot of personal conflicts that people experienced. So often people had trouble convincing their partners, their girlfriends or their wives to move to Central Asia, and a lot of relationships broke apart based on that. Those who were relatively more privileged tended to go back because they had something to go back to. Also, I think what's really important to note, which was interesting to me, is that, prior to the war and everything that happened, my experience of Russia was mostly limited to St. Petersburg and Moscow, if I'm being completely honest. And in my group of people that I knew, nobody did the mandatory military service. It was unheard of. You bribed your way out of it. You went to university. You didn't do it. But when I started talking to my respondents, most of them had done the military service, the mandatory 1-year military service. And they had done it at age 18, just before the start of the war, or a few years before it. And as a result, many of them, came up again and again in a lot of our discussions, really traumatized by that experience, of hazing, of senseless violence. And so there was just this really, really strong fear of the Russian army. And I think those who had experienced the Russian military, there was, at least among, the people that I talked to, they're not returning because they don't want to take any chances. And there's just this fear of the Russian military and that experience that they don't want to go back. And then those who are more privileged and never were in the Russian military, for example, and who feel like they can come back to a more comfortable life, they have tended to return.
How did Russians change Central Asia? You've already mentioned that the prices of apartments have skyrocketed, that the prices obviously went up too in general. But what are the other ways in which this migration changed the region?
Well, here I'd like to add a small caveat in this discussion is that what gets overlooked, and it's not part of my doctoral research, but I think a very significant portion of those Russian citizens who arrived in Central Asia, and particularly Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, were actually children of immigrants often, so dual citizens. I don't cover them in my research, but I think it's important to mention that you had a lot of young ethnic Kyrgyz, ethnic Uzbek, who were born and raised in Russia, socialized, went to Russian school, went to Russian universities, whose parents told them, okay, you have to get out, you have to go live with your grandparents in our home country. And they're much bigger numbers. We don't know how many of them there are because usually they're dual citizens. And I think they've actually had a huge impact in both countries because they've returned to the country. They've come to a country that maybe they never even really knew. There's big influx. I think that's driven up prices even more, actually, than necessarily just the Russian migrants themselves who are arriving. And I think that's been part of the story of the economic boom, is that there are a lot of businesses opening up, a lot of families pooling money together, or if they've accumulated wealth in Russia, they don't feel comfortable keeping that money in Russia. And so they end up investing in real estate, in businesses, in entrepreneurship. I think the rates of entrepreneurship among young people in Central Asia now in general are just really high. And so people are experimenting, trying all sorts of things. So I think there's this kind of chauvinistic narrative that I hear sometimes about, oh, well, the Russians came, and they brought all this quote unquote high culture with them. And, whether it's electronic music or contemporary art or dance or whatever. And I would hesitate to agree with that, actually. And I would point to the fact that actually most of these initiatives are very local and they're driven by Central Asians themselves. Yes, many of them grew up in Russia. And so I think there's much more of kind of an interaction. It's not necessarily about Russians bringing their cultural capital, but the fact that there's just a lot more exchange going on. And so I think that's impacted the region. And I think the perception of Central Asia has also really changed. I think for a lot of Russian migrants, they came either, like I said, they didn't know much about the region or they had prejudices. And often for them, especially cities like Bishkek and Almaty, were actually an example of a global city. So one that was open. It's the first time that they encountered Westerners because they would encounter travelers or backpackers who are coming from the West. And through that lens, they also start to kind of appreciate the nature and the rich diversity of culture and the history. and so on. And so I think now there's this kind of, however many years on, there's this new group of Russian migrants who are now quite patriotic, who are quite, who will defend kind of Central Asians vis-a-vis other Russians, who will correct Russians who mispronounce countries' names or refer to Central Asia as, Middle Asia in Russian and so on. So I think that's been a big impact that they've had on the region.
I wanted to ask you about the reaction of local Russians or Russian speakers to the arrival of people from Russia. From what I've noticed, especially looking at Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, many local Russians started getting more patriotic, I would say. Many started learning the local languages, which they never did. Even though they had classes like Kazakh or Uzbek classes at school, they never managed to actually learn the language properly. And with the arrival of Russians from Russia, people started being interested more in the local cultures, in the local languages. So based on your observations and your research, do you think this was a significant number of people who started, being interested in local cultures, languages? And what are the other ways in which local Russian speakers reacted to the influx of Russians from Russia?
So I think, it's interesting. I think even linguistically, there became a difference where local Russians, at least in the case of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, they started to kind of refer to themselves as Orus, that, we're not Ruski, we're Orus, we're like the local Russian. And that became a kind of category of distinction. And it's not a focus necessarily of my research, but I met quite a few local Russians in Bishkek who were upset, basically saying like, oh no, these privileged or kind of wealthy, that was the stereotype, Russians who are arriving, they're giving us a bad reputation, right? And we're like, why are we getting, people will assume that we're also a relocant and that we just arrived, but I was born and raised here. And so it created a lot of kind of frustration often. And many of local Russians wanted to distance themselves, especially the younger ones, from the new arrivals, I would say. But then there's a big generational gap. So I think a lot of the Russian migrants who arrived then struggled actually often with local Russians. They would get into political fights, especially with the older generation. So I had a lot of respondents complaining to me saying, well, I have, older Russians like pensioners or whatever who are still nostalgic about the Soviet Union, and they'll come up to me and say, either you're a traitor or they'll tell me how much they love Putin, or they're going to express forms of Russian nationalism, and Russian migrants who arrived would be uncomfortable with that. And so they would say, like, how is it that the Russians in Central Asia or the older ones seem to be more vatnik, more kind of supportive of Russian state narratives than even my own family back home? And so that caused a lot of friction, I would say. And then I think what's also important to kind of keep in mind is that a lot of the Russians who were living there, and you brought that up, right? Because there was this sense of trying to distinguish themselves from those new arrivals, they started learning the language, because if you pepper your speech with at least some local expression words, there's also certain Russian expressions that are kind of particular to Central Asia but are not used in Russia, and it became a kind of a form of pride to mention that in order to mark yourself as different and as local.
You mentioned that already, but maybe let's expand on it a little bit. So what's the situation in Central Asia for Russians now? We know that, there has been rumors that Kazakhstan is planning to start deporting people to Russia. It hasn't happened yet, but definitely politically, Russians are in a much more difficult position than they were at the beginning of the war. So can you tell us a little bit about what the situation looks like now and whether there is any difference between Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan?
Kazakhstan started implementing migration restrictions very early on, as I had mentioned. And so right now, they already have pretty harsh requirements when it comes to getting a work permit. So you already have to show that you have the proof of housing, proof of employment, or proof of enrollment in a university. it was known, as I mentioned before, that a lot of people would purchase these work contracts and they weren't fully legal. And now there's been these massive checks, right? Now, I think they're in the process of annulling a lot of these residence permits and saying that they were issued on illegal basis because people would purchase work contracts. So Kazakhstan has been kind of, I think, the most restrictive. And now with these new language requirements as well, I've seen that circulating, and we'll have to see what will happen. I mean, what level of Kazakh will be required in order to get a residence permit. Kyrgyzstan was the most open for a very long time. You could just needed to register, and then every 6 months you could extend your registration. That ended at the end of 2024. Now you also need to apply for a residence permit. There have not been a lot of refusals, but it's still burdensome in terms of bureaucracy. You need to get quite a lot of medical tests and other things done. But Kyrgyzstan still remains quite open. There's no language requirement. You just need a paper from your landlord and to show proof of funds. And that's enough for you to live in Kyrgyzstan. Uzbekistan has a whole separate set of rules because they're not part of the Eurasian Economic Union. But I would say that actually, in fact, Uzbekistan, in a weird way, because Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan have restricted their migration policy, where Uzbekistan hasn't, as far as I know, hasn't changed their rules that much. Uzbekistan is almost easier to be in these days. But I'm not as well versed in the reality of Uzbekistan. I don't think it's like more people are necessarily arriving. And then I think what's become really apparent is that the Eurasian Economic Union should, on paper, allow free access to the labor market and freedom of mobility. And both of these things de facto no longer exist. And I would say that started in Russia, right? Russia was not following its own Eurasian economic agreements by constantly introducing new restrictions, even for Kazakh and Kyrgyz citizens who were Eurasian Economic Union members. They kept on increasing the hurdles. And so this is kind of the response. And so I think in a way we're seeing the end of the Eurasian Economic Union to a certain extent, at least in terms of migration and labor. It's really not functioning anymore. It's more and more restrictive. We'll see where it goes from here. The threat of deportation is, everyone's really paranoid about that. I mean, I'm in a lot of these group chats on Telegram, and it's a huge concern. Kazakhstan was perceived as relatively safe because, as you know, in the first few years, there were several attempts of deportation of political activists, but always they would stop it at the last moment, with a few exceptions. In Kyrgyzstan, deportations have already taken place, so that's already a reality. So I think there's a lot of anxiety among the Russians who are there. You know, some have tried to get citizenship. There was a lot of kind of moral panic around citizenship. I think in the end, actually, the only ones who managed to really get citizenship were some corrupt officials from Russia who kind of bought their passports. But as a general rule, not a lot of people have managed to get the citizenship. So yeah, and so they're in a precarious situation where now they've been in the country for quite a long period of time, for 4 years now, and yet it could all end tomorrow, depending on what policies, decisions are made at a high level. And since it's so opaque, we don't know what agreements are being made. Is this just populism? Is there some sort of agreement with the Russian government? There's also, this is important to mention, there's also new legislation coming into place that forces Russians abroad to register with their embassies. And there's fear that the next step will be the same thing that happened to Belarusian citizens, where basically you will have to go back to Russia in order to get any kind of travel document, because before you could renew at the embassy. It looks like that might change. There's also a lot of fear around that, about the cooperation between the Russian embassy and local authorities. And so we don't know. I mean, it seems stable for a little while, but things can really change very quickly.
Thank you, Yan. This was really, really fascinating. And good luck with your PhD. Is it almost done?
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Yeah, I'm in the final stretch. I'm having some funding issues and so on, but hopefully, it should be done this year.
Perfect. So I really hope to read it soon. And thank you so much for being with us. That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.